Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, how are my snipers doing today? I hope you guys are doing fantastic. Listen, today we're talking about the one and only Zebec network. Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, the market is seeing a little bit of a sell off just because the way the Bitcoin weekly closed, right? It closed pretty poorly when we look at it, right? It was a massive rejection off of sweeping these highs. We closed, fairly bad, right? $117,500. And we can see instant reaction from the beginning of the Monday candle. So there's a decent chance that we will be selling off a little bit more right over the next few days until we see some type of reversals. But do not get scared, ladies and gentlemen. I know it may seem scary, but for something like Zebec Network, the last few days we really have been getting confirmation, right? Pretty much when we were in this narrow trend line, everything was looking good and solid. We pretty much said, look, not Turbo, but Zebec has to make a choice very, very soon. And even though this trend line broke, we technically still could have gone up because we had a high, lower high, lower high, we had bottom, higher bottom, and higher bottom, right? We had multiple with the bottom and the top closing in on each other. And we said, look, it's either going to be, continuation to the upside to contest these highs. But then once we contest these highs, we would sell off a drastic amount, right? We said we'd probably go back down a decent amount. And then once we contest the highs again, we probably wouldn't really sell off and then we would launch off, right? Something like this, where we would come to the highs, sell off a good amount, and then the next time we'd go to the highs for a third time, we wouldn't really contest that much, and then we would sell. Or we said pretty much, when we do pull back, we'll pull back a little bit more this time, but then the next time we go, we probably won't really sell off that much, and then we were going to pump, right? Either way, there was going to be most likely a decent pullback one way or another. But look, ladies and gentlemen, right? This is a good thing. You want crypto to be fundamental because when you're not fundamental, you get punished. Okay. The reality is you get punished. The only time you don't really get punished, ladies and gentlemen, is when altcoin season happens and those, beautiful couple of weeks just pump and pump and pump and pump. But then, you could debate, well, you do get punished because then you have to wait years for the corrections. And it's like, well, in that case, you're technically right. But at least before you have the opportunity to make very, very insane gains. Now, look, ladies and gentlemen, right? The bias still remains the same. We believe that there's a high probability seeing a reaction off of the 0.004 zone, right? Does this automatically mean we're going to hold and just bounce off of here? No, not necessarily. You would have to see some type of lower time frame confirmations, but it is very high probability that we will maintain and hold over here just because how Zebec has been super, super bullish and just how overall the markets are moving, right? When we go to something like the weekly, we know it's a very, very nice zone. We could potentially see a potential spike, maybe to 0.0036, but nothing too crazy. In terms of the monthly, ladies and gentlemen, for me, if we close even the way we close or lower, we're still going to be fine. The reason why I say this is because we have a low over here at 0.003. And then, of course, we have a high over here at 0.0062. And then we have another high right over here at 0.0051. Okay, so at this current moment, we are trending down a little bit in terms of the highs, but we're also trending up in terms of the lows. And we've seen kind of something similar on the weekly before, right? We've seen something similar on the weekly where we were getting higher lows, right? Boom, the end of June at 0.0027, and then another one at 0.0032, right? We saw this and then we had explosion. So for me, this is just going to be the same thing most likely playing out, but on the monthly, which is even better. Now, of course, we still technically have around 2 weeks to go. So do not get too excited like just yet. But overall, I still expect Zebec to be fairly bullish. Remember, the markets move like they're roller coasters. So, one a couple of weeks it's up, the next few weeks, it's slowly selling off. And then again, it's strong momentum to the upside. And then eventually we have a breakout from the breakout, we pump, pump, pump. And then again, we have a nice long correction for multiple weeks usually. Then we go sideways a little bit. And then again, we have a mini breakout just the way we did here. And it's like the same thing over and over, right? Do not get baited. Do not get baited, ladies and gentlemen, right? I know it's hard seeing, potentially certain amount of profits get eaten up a couple percent per day. That might rack up in a decent amount of money, just gone all of a sudden. But just know that this is still part of the journey. This is still part of the cycle. When we look at something like Bitcoin, yes, we are selling off and we might be potentially even giving, Bitcoin top vibes, to be honest, right? That could be the case that we are potentially topping out. We still have to see how the monthly and the 3 month close, but just in terms of the weekly candle, right? This is a pure institutional type of candle. So this is dangerous, right? Once you start seeing these types of candles, you gotta start preparing yourself. Look, overall, even though if Bitcoin would top, the main thing we are concerned about is Bitcoin dominance. Now, this thing has been lingering around for many, many days. We know pretty much once we get multiple closes below the 60%, we should really see a sell off. But, we did get it close at 59.42%, but then usually there's a pullback week anyway. So we'll see how this week plays out. We'll see if we, you know, engulf and reclaim territory, or if we're just simply going up to then slam further down, which, like I said, obviously is very, very important because Bitcoin dominance selling off means altcoins going up. Bitcoin dominance tanking to the ground means altcoin season and everything going up drastically. Now, I've personally seen that there's a very, very high chance, like 98, 99%, for a 25-point drop for the federal rate cuts. I even heard rumors about the 50 rate cuts, right? Some people are saying, it's not going to happen, but from the sources I've seen, it said there's a chance. Now, I know there was some data that I think came out on Wednesday, and people are saying now it'll lower the chance by a little bit. And even that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, I still think there's going to be some type of rate cut at the bare minimum, at least 25 points, which would be very, very nice. The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, right, got to remember this cycle may be slightly different. It's going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be dragged out a little bit more. Why? Because Bitcoin's moving different. Bitcoin is moving very institutional, and Bitcoin is just doing its own thing. And you got to remember, with more money in the cycle means that it's going to take longer to really pump everything. And that's just the truth, right? If we go to something like Zebec, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not even going to use Zebec as the main example, but when there's a coin, let's say a meme coin that just comes out and it goes to like a million market cap, it sells off back to like 200K. It can cycle out and pump again within even 2 or 3 days, but you can't really do that once a coin has a lot of market cap, a lot of volume. It just doesn't work that way. It takes weeks and weeks and months, even, right? And then eventually it takes years. When you're talking about something like Bitcoin, this thing has trillions in market cap. So you guys got to realize, the whole cycle is probably going to be extended by an extra whole year, which is why altcoin season, is most likely going to happen in fall, in my opinion, still. And if it doesn't, we obviously will have to adjust our plans. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that is ultimately it. I hope you guys did enjoy. I love you guys so, so much, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.